Good morning. Now, you probably don't know it, but the history of America is entwined with the history of a vegetable called the groundnut. The groundnut predates colonial times. It is a native food. And I'm not talking about the peanut. I'm talking about Apios americana, the American groundnut. In early colonial times, this is one of those foods that the natives introduced the colonists to, and it became part of the staple diet, so much so that the colonists eventually ended up restricting the Indians from digging these tubers on colonist property, which is kind of a sad history, but it is part of the history of New England and also of other parts of the country. Now, the groundnut itself is really the edible portion is a tuber that grows under the ground. This is a typical groundnut tuber, about the size of the typical groundnut tuber. This is an extraordinarily large groundnut tuber, and I've recently gotten some groundnuts that are much larger than the ones that I used to grow. So the newer ones are averaging between this large and this large, which is quite a bit larger, like I say, than sort of the typical size of the groundnut that you might commonly find. So I am actually doing a giveaway today. For the first person who places a comment in my feed here and says, yes, I'm interested in the groundnut, I will send you a bag of these groundnuts. We'll just have to get in touch another way so I can collect your address, and you get to try growing this yourself. So, like I said, it's not a nut, it's a legume. It grows underground as these tuberous roots, and above ground it has a vine, a very thin vine. It's a wispy vine with beautiful foliage, a beautiful, beautiful climbing vine, and it can integrate into your sort of food forest style garden that way. However, I will warn you, you want to grow it in a raised bed or a container, because once you plant it, it's very difficult to get out of your soil, and it will travel quite a distance just under the surface of the ground and spread. So once it's planted, you'll have it for a long time. I, this year, have been growing them in with Jerusalem artichokes for the first time. This is sort of a historic coupling of these two plants. They supposedly, this is how they've been grown in the past, although I think probably in earlier times they were more of a foraged food. But growing them with the Jerusalem artichoke is handy, because first of all, you dig both of them, so it's easy to harvest them. You can harvest them together. But secondly, the Jerusalem artichoke, especially some of the stiffer varieties of stalks, will provide a really great climbing post for these wispy vines. And so it can be an attractive collection, and that's how I've been growing it out in the front yard for the last year. But I've been growing it probably for a decade or more. It's one of those things that I'm kind of attached to almost sentimentally, almost unreasonably sentimentally, because it's just not that convenient as a food. So as a food, this plant is a challenge to prepare. I found the best way to serve it is in a stew, and then it is really very similar to a potato. But if you try to do things like mashing with it or serving them whole, you'll find that they're quite dry. At least I found that they're quite dry, a little too dry for my taste. And so it doesn't necessarily make the best side dish. However, it can be a really great addition to a stew once and assuming you have enough. The preparation of it is a challenge. In cutting into these things, the first thing you'll notice is you start to get this sticky latex sap on your hands, and it's very difficult to get that off of your skin. It will also get on your cutting board, on your knife, and so it becomes a little bit of a cleanup problem. I have taken to preparing them on a sheet of parchment paper, so at least I can preserve my cutting board. The knife, being stainless steel, is easier to clean, and then I'm just left with these sort of sticky, pitchy hands. I'm going to try actually pre-boiling them. Maybe a little parboiling would help to get rid of that sticky sap on the outside layer, so I could peel them and cut them a little more easily. Haven't tried that yet, and honestly, like I say, I don't eat lots and lots of these. I'm sentimentally attached to this plant. I also like the fact that it's a nitrogen fixer. So it's a perennial nitrogen fixer, which is a good thing to have in the vicinity of your garden. You can take the vines and compost them, and that will add nitrogen to your soil, that sort of thing. I'm not sure if you want to just take the vines and dig them into your garden. You might find that they spread. I've never really tried that, so I don't know for sure what they would do. So those are some of the reasons that I grow it, mostly because it is a beautiful plant. It is a native plant. It fits in well with some of my guilds, and I can eat it sometimes, but it's never going to be a staple food for me. My sense is probably even back in colonial times, they ate much more of this in the wintertime when there wasn't as much food available. And then in the summertime or spring through fall, they probably preferred to eat other kinds of foods. But it does have that long history, which I find entertaining and at the same time sometimes tragic. When you think about, like, during King Philip's War, for example, when the colonists and the Indians led by King Philip, when they were skirmishing and the Indians were being chased further and further out, they were subsisting on foods like the groundnut. So that is frequently mentioned in older, actually literature of that time and stories about what was going on. You also see reference to it in the colonists' descriptions of their pursuit of the Indians. They are subsisting on groundnuts and whatever else they can forage. So it's one of those things that turns up a lot back in the day, but after the 1800s, when other foods came into cultivation and were more readily available, the groundnut was forgotten. Probably a lot of the areas where the groundnut was growing were then turned into fields, and the groundnut was probably removed from a lot of these places. You will find groundnuts still in the wild along riverbanks in places. I have taken some of mine and transplanted them out into areas where I think they will probably do well and perhaps come back as a native population a little bit more than they have by themselves. We've divided everything up so much that even though these spread pretty aggressively once they are introduced to a spot, they can't really cross over compacted earth because they grow just underneath the soil. And so when you have trails and things like that, it will limit the area that they can grow. And so there probably still are some out in the wild in other locations along riverbanks that I haven't found. Now these are also, they're not just in New England, they spread out in throughout cooler areas in the United States. I'm not sure exactly what the hardiness zone of this plant is, but I know it is pretty hardy, and I think it's probably good up into the top of the United States and into Canada, and I'm pretty sure that it goes pretty far south as well. So it's a pretty versatile plant, easy enough to grow, certainly easy to get started, and once you get it started, it may stick around for a long time. So just be aware of that. Always consider a container for this particular plant. You can't call it invasive because it was here before we were, but it is definitely opportunistic, and it might not be the sort of thing that you want to have popping up all over your garden. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this talk, a little bit of history about the groundnut. Please leave a comment below and a thumbs up, and please check us out at the foodforestgardenclub.org website. I would love to see you there and get to meet you online in one of our chatting meetups on like Zoom or what have you. And you become part of that community, start sharing some seeds with us, and I know you're going to get more out of it than you give. It's a wonderful group of people that we're putting together, and we're really enjoying the process. So thanks again. I hope you have a wonderful day.